Hey, sports history fans, this is Ariel Gonzalez from Wrestling with Heels On. Hey, when you go to a sporting event, you don't go there to be meek and mild, unless you live in Japan. You go there to get freaking wild. That means bringing some attitude to your amplitude. How do you do that? You get Racket. R-A-K-I-T. Racket combines a compact 7-inch megaphone, 8 powerful adjustable LED lights, noisemakers, an insert you design, and it's all fully customizable to match your team's colors. Now here's the coolest thing about this product. J.J. Abraham, the founder, was the ultimate cheer dad. He followed his daughter's cheer group around the country, and he saw parents struggling using all sorts of crazy contraptions to make some noise for their kids. And then he had an aha moment. He thought, wait, why not combine all of these doodads into an all-in-one compact device for the ultimate fan? JJ and his team worked 3 years on developing version after version after version until they finally landed on Racket, R-A-K-I-T, so you can make some noise and cheer and be a part of the action. So get out there and let's get loud. Bring a racket to your next game or competition to cheer on your favorite team or athlete. You can customize your racket with your own logos, drawings, and names. Get beads to match your team's colors. Flashing lights add to the excitement. Are you ready to make a racket? Be part of the game. Each racket pack comes with 1 racket megaphone, 1 lanyard to keep a hold of the thing, 2 scratch-resistant bead packs, 1 clear and 1 color of your choice, and a 10-pack of customizable self-adhesive inserts. Currently on sale, wait for it, $24.99. To pick up your racket today, head to myracket.com. That's myrakit.com. Now get out there and make some noise.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
The Rose Bowl. The game that inspired the college football bowl season has a long and storied history. The stadium itself is 100 years old, and in celebration of it, Pigskin Dispatch is assembling some of the top historians and authors to share the memories, people, and events that make the granddaddy of them all the special game that it is. Enjoy this Rose Bowl memory from pigskindispatch.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pigpen, your portal to positive football history. And it is Rose Bowl month. We're having a great time learning about the history of the Rose Bowl, bringing in an all-star cast of guests to talk about this great historic venue for football. And tonight is no exception. We have an author that's been here about a couple months ago talking about his book on Duke Slater. It's Neal Rozendaal. Welcome back to the Pigpen.
Hey, thanks for having me back. It's good to be here.
Yeah, Neal, we had such a great time talking about your book a couple months ago on Duke Slater, just a great, collegian and great football player. And, you have some other football books. And tonight we'd like to talk about another one because it has a lot of ties into the Rose Bowl. And I'll let you introduce the subject of that book and some of the statistics about him.
Yeah, so my most recent book came out a little over a year ago, and it's a biography on Bump Elliott. It was his name, Bump Elliott, and of course I come into it as a Hawkeye, a University of Iowa graduate and fan, and many Hawkeye fans know Bump Elliott as the longtime athletic director at the University of Iowa, but he had an incredible career. Before that, in particular, he spent a lot of time at the University of Michigan, and he really had an indelible impact on 2 Big Ten institutions, both at Michigan and at Iowa. and he also had a little bit. He had spent a little bit of time at Purdue as well. So he had all connections all around the Big Ten. But probably the thing that Bump Elliott is most known for around the Big Ten is that he is the only man to have participated in the Rose Bowl in 5 different capacities. He was a player, an assistant coach, a head coach, an assistant athletic director, and a head athletic director. And in all 5 of those capacities, he saw his school and helped guide his school to the Rose Bowl. And as such, in 1989, he was an inaugural member of the Rose Bowl Hall of Fame. The Rose Bowl started up a Hall of Fame in 1989, and they inducted 4 members, and Bump Elliott was one of those 4. So he had a long, long history with the Rose Bowl. He loved the Rose Bowl, and he's an important part of its history. And he's a great, great man, and I love talking about him. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write that book, because he's an incredibly accomplished man, but also just really an outstanding guy.
Wow, with that many visits and that many capacities at the Rose Bowl, it's almost like he was an employee of the Rose Bowl there that often. So I'm intrigued. Can you talk a little bit about each capacity, like what team he was with and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So Bump Elliott, he got his start collegiately, actually at Purdue University. He played a couple of seasons at Purdue, and it's interesting because his first year at Purdue, they actually went on to have an unbeaten and untied record that season and finished number 5 in the country, which to this day is the highest that Purdue has ever finished in the national rankings. That's the only team to finish in the top 5 in the nation, and that was with Bump Elliott at Purdue in 1943. And then Bump left for a couple of years to serve in the service during World War II. He was a lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps, and he actually spent some time in China serving during that time. And when he finished and he was done, he wound up at the University of Michigan. He came back to the States. He really had no reason to go back to Purdue, because everybody he kind of came up with and through, they had all been enlisted or had been deployed, and there was nobody sort of back there that he knew, so he had no real reason to go back to West Lafayette. And his younger brother, Pete Elliott, actually had gone to Michigan, and had always sent Bump Elliott letters about how much he liked Michigan, how he liked playing there. And so Bumps had said he always wanted to play football with his brother. His brother was, not only was Pete Elliott Bump's younger brother, he's also really his best friend. And he decided to go to Ann Arbor to join him. And the Elliott brothers spent a couple years there at Michigan. So Bump was in 1947 a part of the Mad Magicians at the University of Michigan, which is one of the greatest teams, not only in Michigan football history, one of the greatest teams in college football history. And that is the first time he went to the Rose Bowl. He went to the Rose Bowl, the 1948 Rose Bowl, as a member of the Mad Magicians. And Bump Elliott was a truly great football player in his day. He was a phenomenal athlete. But that was really his first Rose Bowl experience, and his first exposure to the Rose Bowl was beginning in 1948. And a commentator many years later commented that the Rose Bowl didn't begin with Bump Elliott. It just sort of seems that way. And so he had a long and deep connection, but that was his first exposure to the Rose Bowl all the way back in 1948, the 1948 Rose Bowl.
Now, what position did he play at Michigan?
Well, it's kind of a fascinating story, because he was right on this transition where prior to World War II, players played both ways. Guys played on both sides of the ball. And his team in the 1947 Michigan Wolverines, again, they were one of the great teams in college football history. And what they did was they did something sort of fascinating. It was Fritz Chrysler. He took advantage of some of these relaxed substitution rules that were enacted during World War II. Prior to World War II, if a player left the game, they could not re-enter the game until a quarter had passed. That was part of the rules of it. You couldn't just have free substitution. Well, they suspended that rule during World War II because during World War II there was a lack of players. Most of the kids were in the service, and they needed warm bodies. A lot of these programs were shutting down for lack of manpower. So they said, let's just get rid of these substitution rules. So they suspended them for a while. And it was Fritz Chrysler, the head coach at Michigan, really realized, now that these substitution rules are suspended, I can platoon players. I can have players play offense and a whole different group of players play defense. And in 1947, Michigan had just a wealth of athletic talent. There were a bunch of guys who came back from the war, and they had, almost too many players. So Fritz Chrysler solved this problem by having players play on both sides. Instead of having players play on both sides of the ball, he platooned them. He had an offensive unit and a defensive unit. And that was really the first time that had been tried at sort of a major level in college football history. What's interesting about that whole setup is Bump Elliott was the only player on the Michigan football team who still played on both sides of the ball for the entire year. So at the beginning of the year, there were two players, Bump Elliott and Jack Weisenberger, who played on both sides of the ball. With every change of possession, 9 guys would go off the field, and then 9 new players would come onto the field. Offense and defense, they'd switch. Jack and Bump Elliott were the only two who sort of stayed on the field. Well, by the middle of the season, Jack Weisenberger, he got a little bit dinged up, and so they decided to substitute for him as well. So by the end of the year, and in the 1948 Rose Bowl, on every change of possession, 10 players would come off the field, and 10 new players would come onto the field and join Bump Elliott, who was always on the field. Bump played halfback on the offensive side of the ball, and then he was a defensive back on the defensive side of the ball. So he was still one of those players who played both ways for a team that did not have many players who played both ways. Bump was one of the few guys that did it. And so that's why at the end of the year, he was named the most valuable player of the 1947 Mad Magicians and the Big Ten MVP of the 1947 season, because he was valuable to the team because he played both ways. For him, if you lost Bump Elliott, you lose a great offensive player and a great defensive player. So that was sort of the magic of the Mad Magicians, was they really were one of the first teams to take advantage of sort of the platoon system of going offense and defense.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great story, like you said. So they're sort of the ones that made it in vogue to have double platoons coming in. So now, okay, so you mentioned that they went to the Rose Bowl there, that 47 team. So it would have been the 1948 Rose Bowl. Who did they play in, and how'd they do in that game?
They played USC, and they did pretty well. They won 49-0.
I'd say that's pretty well.
The 1947 season was interesting because Michigan and Notre Dame both did not play each other. And this was back when Michigan and Notre Dame hated each other. They had this rivalry where they would not play. But they both wound up winning games, blowing out opponents. And, they were both undefeated. And the Associated Press poll was sort of toggling back and forth who's number one in the country. One week it was Michigan. The next week it was Notre Dame. It just depended on who had a good game that week. Notre Dame wound up finishing number one in the nation on the final after their regular season finale. Notre Dame then, as they often did, finished the regular season against USC. And they beat USC convincingly, and the Associated Press put Notre Dame number one. Now, that was back in the day when the AP poll stopped at the end of the regular season. So the AP poll was done. And Notre Dame did not go to a bowl game. They were an independent and so forth. But Michigan got to go to the Rose Bowl. They qualified. They were undefeated. And lo and behold, they played the Pacific Coast champion, which was USC. And they were very motivated to beat USC by a larger score than Notre Dame had. Notre Dame beat them, I believe, something like 38-17 or something. And Michigan came out there and put it on USC and wound up winning 49-0, which tied the record for the most lopsided result in Rose Bowl history, going back to the very first Rose Bowl, which Michigan won over Stanford by an identical 49-0 score. And so they actually did something unprecedented. The AP decided to revote afterwards in sort of an unofficial capacity. And in the revote, Michigan was actually voted number one by a 2-1 margin over Notre Dame, which they immediately said this is unofficial. Notre Dame is still our national champion. But most historians looking back on the 1947 season award sort of a split national title between Michigan and Notre Dame. And it was always sort of viewed as one of the great games that never took place. Who would have won in 1947, Michigan or Notre Dame? Is one of the great debates in sports history. But yeah, Michigan obviously did very well, and Bump Elliott had a great experience in his first appearance in the Rose Bowl. He caught a touchdown pass and enjoyed a lopsided victory over the Trojans.
Wow, very, very nice. That was a great team, like you said. So it would have been interesting to see those two teams play too. So okay, so there's one capacity that Bump Elliott's in there. So what comes up next in his career going to the Rose Bowl?
Well, he was like I said, he was a great player. He actually played 3 sports at Michigan. He also played basketball and baseball. He's actually a very talented baseball player, but he back in those days they had what was called the College All-Star Game, which in the College All-Star Game, basically the departing senior class across college football would assemble an all-star team, and they play an exhibition game in Chicago against the reigning NFL champions. So the team that won the most recent NFL championship would play this team of college all-stars. And Bump Elliott joined the college all-star team. He was actually named the captain of the college all-star team in 1948. So he's the captain of the team, but Bump was injured in a practice in a scrimmage a couple of days before the game and was not able to actually play in the game. He suffered a bad knee injury, which caused him to be hospitalized. He had to have surgery on his knee. And long story short, any professional football career was sort of out the window. He had been drafted by the Detroit Lions, and they certainly had some interest in him. But he decided professional football is not for me. And then he kind of looked, where's my career going to take me? And he sort of fell into what a lot of great athletes fall into, which is coaching. And he was given an opportunity to coach. He was offered an assistant coaching position at Oregon State. He spent 3 years at Oregon State as an assistant coach. What was kind of fun about that was when he started at Oregon State, he was an assistant coach, and his younger brother Pete was also an assistant coach on the same staff. So he and Pete were assistant coach on the same staff for 2 years. And then Bump wanted to come back to the Midwest. That was where his family was. And he was offered an opportunity to become an assistant coach at the University of Iowa under Forrest Evashevski. Forrest Evashevski was named the head coach at Iowa. Forrest Evashevski was a Michigan man. He had played at Michigan several years before Bump Elliott. He played when Tom Harmon was there. But Forrest Evashevski, he was filling out his coaching staff. He needed an assistant coach. He knew of Bump Elliott and hired Bump as his assistant coach. So after a few years, Bump served as an assistant for 5 years at the University of Iowa. And in his 5th and final season in Iowa City, Forrest Evashevski was able to help guide the Hawkeyes to the 1956 Big Ten title and to the 1957 Rose Bowl. And the Hawkeyes knocked off Ohio State in the final game of the Big Ten season and clinched a Big Ten title. And the Hawkeyes went out to Pasadena. And as luck would have it, the Hawkeyes played Oregon State, which was the team that Bump had been an assistant for several years earlier. But the Hawkeyes were able to come away with a victory over Oregon State, and Bump Elliott went to the Rose Bowl in his second capacity as an assistant coach in 1957.
Wow. Okay. And so you gained a second victory too, a second visit, different capacity, and a big win for Iowa. 35-19 is the score of that Rose Bowl. So, wow. So that's got to be pretty cool to go back to the same stadium and get two victories there. Okay. So little did he know that maybe he'd be going there again. So what's his third capacity to visit the Rose Bowl in?
Well, so Bump Elliott was considered to be one of the top coaching prospects in the country as an assistant coach. He was a great recruiter, phenomenal recruiter, and Evashevsky always said that if he was trying to close the deal on a recruit, he just tried to get Bump Elliott alone with one-on-one with the recruit's mother. He's like, and Bump Elliott would sell her on sending her son to Michigan. He's like, that's all I needed to do. Bump Elliott was the closer. Like he was very charming. He was well spoken. He was well dressed. He was good looking. He was very humble about his achievements, but also people knew he was one of the great football players of his time. He was an All-American and so forth. And so a lot of people thought, he might be a potential successor at Iowa to succeed Forrest Evashevsky as head coach, should Forrest Evashevsky ever decide to get out of coaching. But Bump really had his choice of jobs, and he was called back to his alma mater. He wound up going back to the University of Michigan as an assistant coach under Benny Oosterbaan, and who is his position coach when he played. And there was never any formal agreement, but when he went to Michigan, it was pretty well known that he was a potential head coach in waiting. And a couple of years later, when Oosterbaan stepped down, Bump Elliott was named the head coach of the Michigan Wolverines beginning in the 1959 season. He was very young to be a coach. He was only in his 30s at that point, but he was the head coach of the Michigan Wolverines, one of the storied programs in college football history. And it seems like being the head coach of Michigan, boy, he had it all. He just had, the world at his feet, and the world was his oyster. In truth, Michigan was a bit of a dumpster fire. I mean, the Michigan program was in a bit of disarray. When he took over, the 1958 Michigan football team had given up more points than any team in the history of Michigan football. They were a bad defensive team. They had only won 2 games all year, both of those games by 1 point. And they were senior-laden teams. They were losing most of their talent. As bad as they were defensively, offensively, they were actually worse because they were running the single wing offense, which by that time was kind of antiquated. And part of the reason why Michigan wanted to hire Bump Elliott is because they wanted Bump to install the wing T offense that Evashevsky had used to great success at Iowa. And he had learned that under Forrest Evashevsky. But the one thing that I always talk about with Bump at Michigan is it's hard for people to believe, but Michigan did not believe in recruiting. They didn't believe in recruiting. They believed that Fritz Chrysler, who at that time was the athletic director, said that he hated the thought of the school choosing the boy instead of the boy choosing the school. And so they didn't believe in recruiting. But who did believe in recruiting was Woody Hayes at Ohio State and Duffy Daugherty at Michigan State. And they were really starting to beat Michigan up on the field because they were taking all the best talent. And Bump came in and he said, look, guys, we got to recruit. If we don't recruit, we're not going to get anywhere. And, for him to walk in and say that was a huge change, but also you can't just walk in and say, okay, we're recruiting now. There wasn't rivals.com. There wasn't, how do you find recruits? Well, the way you found recruits in those days was you had alumni in various cities essentially scouting talent for you and trying to find where all the best talent was. Michigan didn't have any of that apparatus set up. And they, when Bump took over at Michigan, he said, look, guys, it's going to be I'm going to need 5 years to rebuild this program. And nobody questioned it because that's how far behind Michigan was on the curve in terms of competing with these bigger schools. It's amazing to think now, but again, there wasn't the portal. You couldn't turn programs around that quickly. Freshmen weren't eligible. Like, even if you recruited a kid to campus, he had to wait a year before he could even play. Like, this was going to be a huge rebuilding job, and they took their lumps for the first few years. But as fate would have it, in Bump's sixth season, he had 5 years where they kind of tried to turn the program around. And in season number 6, the 1964 Wolverines pulled off a tremendous season. They were a great team in 1964. This 1964 Michigan team. They lost one game, that by a single point, 21-20 to Purdue. Michigan scored a touchdown late in the game, went for 2 in the win. They could have had the tie because in those days there was no overtime. They could have kicked the extra point, gotten a tie, and stayed undefeated. They went for 2 in the win because they said, we're going to win, and play came up short, so they wound up losing by 1. But they wound up winning the Big Ten title outright, capped off by a memorable victory in Columbus, Ohio, over Woody Hayes and Ohio State for the Big Ten title. They won the de facto Big Ten title game 17-0 over Ohio State, which sent them to the Rose Bowl. And Bump, in his third capacity, this time as the head coach at Michigan, he went back to the Rose Bowl, and would you believe, lo and behold, faced Oregon State again. Faced his the old team he coached, and the team he beat as an assistant coach at Iowa. And they went to play Oregon State in the Rose Bowl, and they won this one decisively. They won that one in a lopsided manner, and Bump Elliott, in helping guide Michigan to a win in the 1965 Rose Bowl, Bump became the only man in Big Ten history to win a Rose Bowl as a player, and then go on and lead that same Big Ten team to a Rose Bowl victory as a coach. So he was able to win for the same Big Ten team as both a player and a coach, and he was the only man in Big Ten history to do so, and I believe still the only man in Big Ten history to record Rose Bowl wins as a player and a coach of the same Big Ten team. A couple have done it on the Pac-12 side, but Bump's the only one who's ever done that as a Big Ten coach, and that was a huge victory for him, and really one of the great teams in Michigan history.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So now he's 3-0 in his visits to the Rose Bowl with teams he's involved with. So he's got a pretty good record going here with the Rose Bowl. You know, I can see why he wanted to keep going back. All right. So tell us about his fourth capacity going to the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, well, he continued to coach for several more years, but really, once they won, and then he kind of turned the program around, he had really turned his attention to what's my next move. And he did not want he's not someone who wanted to be in coaching forever. A lot of coaches in those days felt it was a young man's profession, and he started to think, well, what am I going to do next? And what he really felt was his next career move was to go into athletic administration, and was to become go into the front office and be an athletic director. So Bump, having been at Michigan and having been a star at Michigan, I think the athletic director of Michigan at that time was Fritz Chrysler. And I think, Fritz Chrysler had been the head coach at Michigan before he became athletic director. And prior to Fritz Chrysler becoming Michigan's AD, the previous athletic director was Fielding Yost, who's also the head football coach turned athletic director. So I think there was a lot of thought that, Bump Elliott, as the head football coach, might be in a position to become the athletic director and succeed Fritz Chrysler as Michigan's athletic director when Chrysler stepped down. And I think he never really publicly came out and said that. But everything I've gathered is that is really kind of the job he wanted. That was really what he saw himself potentially becoming, was the athletic director at the University of Michigan, and maybe trying to help lead them to a Rose Bowl again. He'd done it as a player, done it as a coach. Maybe he could do it as an athletic director. But in 1968, Chrysler had announced he was going to retire. Michigan was looking for a successor, and Bump was considered by some to be a favorite to potentially get that job. But Michigan decided to throw a curveball, and instead of hiring Bump, they hired Don Canham, who was then the track coach, but who also ran a multi-million-dollar sporting goods business. And sort of that business background was kind of what I think attracted them to Canham over Bump Elliott. Bump Elliott was a very stable, steady personality, whereas Canham was a butt kicker, a mover and a shaker, and a guy who'd shake things up. And I think there was a sense at Michigan that things had gotten a little bit stagnant there, and they wanted a little more energy. And so they decided to hire Don Canham. And they hired him prior to the 1968 football season. So Bump coached it at Michigan for the 1968 season. He finished that year for them. Again, they hired Canham right before spring practice was opening. Bump stayed on for that 1968 season. But after that 68 season, he did something remarkable. You would think that having been turned down for sort of his dream job, the athletic director at the University of Michigan, you'd think there'd be a little bit of animosity there, that Bump Elliott would sort of say, heck with you, heck with Michigan. But that's not who Bump Elliott was. He was such a good guy and a selfless guy. He was not a guy with a lot of ego. He went to Don Canham after the season. He basically said to Don, can I be your number two? Can I be your assistant athletic director? And Don Canham was like, absolutely. Don Canham knew as well as anybody that, Bump Elliott was as qualified for his job as he was. So Don Canham's like, I'd love to have you as my number two and put you on staff here. He said, if we can find a good football coach, it's done. And it was Bump Elliott who said, well, let's look for initial successors. And Bump Elliott is the one who put in a call down to Miami of Ohio to Bo Schembechler. He picked up Bo Schembechler at the airport and hosted him in his house, drove him around town, showed him around Ann Arbor. And it was really Bump who vouched for Canham to Bo and for Bo to Canham, in the sense of saying, he told Don Canham, I think this Bo Schembechler is a good coach. I think he's the kind of guy who could succeed here. And he also told Bo Schembechler, who was concerned about Canham being a new athletic director, he said, listen, Don Canham is going to be the kind of athletic director who's going to get you what you want. He's going to be the kind of athletic director who's going to be able to help you build a program, which, Bump didn't always have access to the resources that some, other coaches had. And so Bo Schembechler was named as the Bump Elliott successor in beginning of the 1969 season. Bo Schembechler came and took over for Bump, who happily became the assistant athletic director. And there's always been talk or thought that maybe Bump was pushed out. People have always suggested, well, maybe Bump Elliott was fired, but that was not at all the case. Bump was ready to move into athletic administration. He wanted to become an athletic director, and he was just, he thought it was the right time to move out of coaching. And what he left Bo Schembechler was a team that was loaded. I mean, he left Bo Schembechler a team that was loaded with talent. In Bump Elliott's final year in 1968, the team went 8-2. They played for the Big Ten title against Ohio State. And he left a lot of talent for Bo Schembechler. He had a very, very talented, maybe one of the most talented recruiting classes in the country coming in. And that 1969 Michigan team was set up for success. But Bo Schembechler took over and just took off with them. Again, part of the reason that Bump's people have underestimated Bump's tenure as a head coach and sort of looked down on it. Bump's final game against Ohio State, Michigan and Ohio State were both playing for the Big Ten title, and it was Bump and Woody Hayes, and it was a good game for the first half. I mean, it was 14-14 going a minute before halftime. Ohio State scored just before the break. Ohio State goes up 24-14 going into halftime. In the third quarter, Ohio State gets another touchdown, and they go up 27-14 going into the fourth. And Bump says, well, this is for the Big Ten title. This is for a shot to go to the Rose Bowl. This is a shot for potentially to play for a national title. He starts calling for passes, like desperately passing the football. And, he's taking risky chances to try to win the game against all odds. Well, what happens is Ohio State picks off these risky passes, and Ohio State winds up scoring a bunch of touchdowns and sort of putting it on Michigan. And the final score looks much more lopsided than the competitiveness that was that game. But that game is always remembered because Michigan wound up winning, scored a touchdown in the final seconds of the game. Michigan goes ahead 50-14, and Woody Hayes goes for 2 and doesn't get it, but Ohio State wins 50-14. And according to legend, this is never actually verified by anybody, but the story that emerged from that was someone asking Woody Hayes, why did you go for 2 up 40-14? And Woody Hayes' response was, because I couldn't go for 3. That's just become sort of one of the classic lines in terms of the Michigan-Ohio State animosity that exists, and also kind of shows a little bit something about Woody Hayes. Like, he was not afraid of running up the score on a guy like Bump Elliott, who would never run up the score on anybody. I mean, Bump Elliott was a gentleman who would, when he had an opportunity to run up the score in 64, and he did not do that because that's not who Bump Elliott was. But it was a notable game because the following year, of course, Bump steps down, Bo Schembechler takes over. The following year, Ohio State and Michigan are playing again for the Big Ten title, and Schembechler reminded his team repeatedly of the 50-14 loss and of how Woody Hayes ran up the score on him. And Michigan was able to turn the tables, knock off Ohio State in what was considered the upset of the century. And Michigan beats Ohio State. Michigan gets to go to the Rose Bowl, clinches the Big Ten title. It was one of the great victories in college football history, and Michigan football history, certainly. And after the game, Bo Schembechler awarded the game ball to Bump Elliott. He brought Bump Elliott in, and he gave Bump the game ball, and he said, I won with your guys. I won with your team, basically. Because, remember, freshmen were ineligible. Every single player for the 1969 Michigan football team was recruited to Ann Arbor by Bump Elliott. They came to Ann Arbor to play for Bump, but it was Bo who took them to the Big Ten title and took them to the Rose Bowl. They went to the 1970 Rose Bowl. Bump, in his capacity as assistant athletic director, went to the Rose Bowl. This one was not as successful as his previous 3 visits. Bo Schembechler actually suffered a heart attack on the eve of the game and was not able to coach. What's fascinating about it is there was a little bit of whispers, talk of with Bo Schembechler not being able to coach the team, maybe Bump could coach the team. Like, maybe Bump would, maybe Bump would serve as the interim and it'd be a chance for Bump to have his last game be something that wasn't the 50-14 blowout, that was in fact Bump's last game. But Bump said, you know what, this isn't my team. It's not my place to do that. And so Bump had one of his coordinators serve as the interim coach for the Rose Bowl. But Michigan, facing USC, did suffer their first ever Rose Bowl defeat in that game. But nevertheless, Bump was able to, as an assistant athletic director, visit the Rose Bowl and go to Pasadena for the 4th time in 1970.
Yeah, and that was a pretty close game too. It was a 10-3 score, so a lot of great defense was played in that game. So yeah, it wasn't like they got blown out or anything. They were in it till the end. So, all right. So,
well, you can imagine what it'd be like to have your head coach suffer a heart attack on the eve of the game. I mean, this was not the best circumstance for Michigan to play its Rose Bowl game against USC. So they hung in there, but ultimately they did take a loss, which was Michigan's first loss in the Rose Bowl, and that is something that Bump had. He never noted it, but it was well known before the game when Bump was the head coach. In the 1965 Rose Bowl, there was a tremendous amount of pressure because Michigan had never lost a Rose Bowl. Michigan had won all their and Bump Elliott did not want to be the first head coach to come out of there with a loss, and so to win that was a big thing. But yeah, a few years later, Michigan obviously did lose with Shem Beckler in the hospital recovering from a heart attack. Michigan suffered their first Rose Bowl loss, but nevertheless, to go in a fourth capacity was a heck of a thing for Bump.
Okay. I mean, definitely another great visit, though. And anytime you get to go to California in the middle of winter, that's always a good time. So, okay. So what's his fifth capacity and what happened there?
Well, yeah. So Bump was only the assistant athletic director at Michigan for about a year and a half. People quickly realized that he'd make a great athletic director as well. And I actually think Bump probably would have stayed at Michigan as an assistant athletic director for a while. He might have stayed there for some time potentially because, for everything that happened, he didn't have any animus toward the University of Michigan, despite the fact that they sort of passed him over for the athletic director chair. But in the summer of 1970, the University of Iowa had a vacancy at athletic director. Forrest Evashevski, who had been head coach at Iowa when Bump was an assistant coach there, Evie had stepped down as a head coach and become the athletic director. Forrest Evashevski is a phenomenal coach, one of the great coaches in college football history. Led the Hawkeyes to 2 Rose Bowl victories, a share of a mythical national championship in 1958. I mean, Forrest Evashevski was a great coach, although he had a very short coaching tenure. He retired as a coach to become the athletic director, and his tenure as athletic director was not as successful. He was a divisive athletic director, particularly with his head football coaches. There was sort of a real atmosphere in the program of you support me, the head coach, or you support the football. You support me as athletic director, or you support my football coach. There's a divisiveness there. There was a lot of disharmony, and to the extent that his football coaches, actively accused him of actively undermining them, and it led to Forrest Evashevski's resignation as athletic director at Iowa in the summer of 1970, and it was actually Evie who, in one of his first interviews after resigning, has said they should bring in Bump Elliott. And the president at the University of Iowa at the time said that was the first time he thought, oh, Bump Elliott. Everyone remembered Bump from having been an assistant coach at Iowa. Everybody loved Bump Elliott. Everybody remembered that, people had talked about him maybe being Evie's successor as head football coach. Everybody loved Bump. He was a guy that got along with everybody. And it was thought that Bump Elliott would be the perfect guy to bring together the football side, the football coaching side, as well as the Evie side, which is the Michigan side and so forth. He'd be able to sort of bring everybody together. They thought Bump would kind of be that unifier that Iowa needed at that time. And again, you remember at Michigan, they passed Bump Elliott over as athletic director because they needed a mover and a shaker and somebody to really but Bump was just a very stable, calming influence. Well, that's what Iowa needed, because Iowa's athletic department was kind of, was divided, and it was a house torn. And Bump came in and was offered the job. And from Bump Elliott's perspective, he said, he had a lot of personal and professional friends in Iowa City that he'd known from his assistant coaching days. His wife, Barbara, had actually said, we came back to Iowa City when Bump was hired as athletic director, and I went back to my old bridge club, and they welcomed me right back in. And there was all the same players that there were since we left town 15 years ago. So Bump knew a lot of people personally and professionally in Iowa City, and that made the Iowa job as athletic director particularly appealing to him. And it was a chance for him to run his own program, which was exciting. And the Michigan people kind of gave him a hard time, of course, as you might expect, going to a rival. They basically said, well, why are you going to Iowa? Iowa will never win. By 1970, Iowa was kind of seen as, they were kind of in the basement of the Big Ten, And the Michigan folks said, Bump, why are you going to Iowa? Iowa will never be successful. And Bump Elliott said, no, you're wrong. I was there when we went to the Rose Bowl. He's like, we were successful before, and we can be successful again. So he had that taste of success at Iowa as an assistant under Evie. He knew Iowa could do it again. Well, it took some doing. It took a while. I'm not going to lie. Bump Elliott hired 2 football coaches, Frank Laudeber and Bob Cummings, neither of whom were able to get Iowa much success. And he wound up having to fire both. And in 1979, he had an opportunity to hire his 3rd football coach. And he hired a guy who wasn't very well known outside of the state of Texas, a coach from North Texas by the name of Hayden Fry. And he hired Hayden Fry and brought him up to Iowa. And he publicly told the reporters and his bosses, he says, "This is the last football coach I'll ever hire." And Hayden Fry afterwards asked Bump, he said, "Why did you say I'm the last football coach you'll ever hire?" And Bump said, "You're the 3rd football coach I'm hiring now. I've hired 2 and had to fire them both." He's like, "If you don't work out, neither will I." And basically he was saying, if you get fired, they're going to be looking for a new athletic director too. So he was obviously very hopeful Hayden Fry would work out. And for those who know college football and Hayden Fry's impact, he certainly worked out at the University of Iowa. He turned the Hawkeye football program around. Hayden actually led the Hawkeyes to 3 Rose Bowls after the 1981, 1985, and 1990 seasons. He actually led Iowa to 3 Rose Bowls. So in 1981, the Hawkeyes were able to break through, go to the Rose Bowl in fairly improbable fashion. And he was able to go back. Bump was able to go back to the Rose Bowl in his 5th capacity as athletic director. And Iowa, again, they lost all 3 of those Rose Bowls under Hayden Fry. They weren't able to win one for him as an athletic director. But it's also interesting to note that when Bump went as I was athletic director after the 1990 season, Bump was the athletic director at Iowa, the 1991 Rose Bowl. Bump had managed to participate in the Rose Bowl in 6 different decades. He'd gone to the Rose Bowl in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s by going to the 1991 Rose Bowl. So, again, he was someone who was a fairly constant presence in Pasadena and really had a remarkable run of success there, despite the fact that in the athletic director chair, his coaches could never bring home a victory in the Rose Bowl.
Wow, that really is amazing. I didn't even think of that. 6 decades. That's great stuff, Neal. Now, I guess you whet our appetite. Why don't you give us the name of your book and where folks can get it at?
Yeah, absolutely. My book, like I said, I wrote a biography on Bump Elliott. It's entitled Bump Elliott, The Best of College Athletics. And it can be found on most booksellers like Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble, or you can buy it directly from me. I'd love that. If anybody wants to buy it straight from me, I'm always welcoming of that. You can go to Elliott.com. Elliott, 2 L's, 2 T's. Elliott's a hard one to spell, but to BumpElliott.com, you can go there and find the book for sale there. And I'd be happy to sell you a copy, sign a copy to you, and what have you. But it was a really fun project to do, to write a book about such an incredible guy who, again, has such an amazing history at the Rose Bowl.
Yeah. Wow. I can tell you're very passionate about him, and your knowledge of him is very extensive, and we really are glad that you shared it with us today, and help us celebrate this Rose Bowl month. Because what a better figure than Bump Elliott to celebrate the Rose Bowl with 6 decades. That's 60% of all the Rose Bowls right there. He was involved in. So at his time, probably more higher percentage than that. So great stuff, and really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us today, Neal.
Yeah, no, it was great. Thanks for having me. And I always love talking about Bump because, the thing about Bump Elliott was he was really the subtitle of the book, The Best of College Athletics. He really believed in college athletics. And he said, I spent my entire career in college sports. He didn't intend it that way, but he wound up spending his whole career in college athletics. And he really believed in what it could be, and essentially what it could be in terms of a positive experience for the people, not only the athletes who go on to play professionally, but those who don't, and who wind up learning lessons in teamwork and leadership from it, who go on to be successful in business lives, professional careers, and whatever else. He believed in college athletics, and I know, as sports evolves, there becomes increasing cynicism in that. But he never shared that. He always believed that college athletics was special, and that the Rose Bowl is a special part of college athletics. And so, it was great to write about someone who, again, not only was a great professional, but also I interviewed over 60 people for the book who knew him at various points in his life, and this is the honest truth. Nobody had a bad thing to say about Bump Elliott. They all, as a professional, as a person. You would think someone would be upset with him sometime about something, but he was such a classy guy, such a dignified guy, and he carried himself in such an impressive way that he was the kind of guy who really represents what college athletics is all about, what college athletics should be about. So it was a fun project to do for sure.
Sounds like a phenomenal human being and great football person, and sure glad that you did all that work and recorded the history of this great man in college football and football history in general, and have it in your book. So thank you for preserving that football history.
No, absolutely. And thanks for having me on. I love talking about it. So I appreciate having an outlet like this to talk about this stuff. It's wonderful, and I appreciate what you do.
Oh, well, thank you. And we hope to have you on again real soon on some other topics, which we'll talk about here later. So thanks a lot, Neal Rozendaal, and his book on Bump Elliott. Once again, why don't you give the title one more time, Neal?
It's Bump Elliott, The Best of College Athletics, and you can find it online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or at bumpelliott.com.
We're taking a peek over at the chains and the down marker. It's 4th and long. We're going to have to punt the ball and get on out of here, but we'll have another series tomorrow for your football history headlines, so be sure to tune in. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast. Pigskindispatch.com is a proud affiliate of the Sports History Network, the headquarters of sports yesteryear.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.